But I'm just going to quickly introduce myself, and then I'm going to ask Grace to introduce herself. So for each of these webinars, I'm going to be joined by a local practice educator from within the partnership. And today I'm going to be joined by Grace, and I know Grace will share some fabulous things with you later. So my name's Siobhan Maclean, and as Joe said, I've been a social worker for 30 years and I've been a practice educator for 27 years. I now do mostly learning and development, but I still work as a practice educator. And during this pandemic, so since March, I have worked with 5 students who have all done what was called a virtual placement. They've all completed their placement now, but I'm going to draw a lot on my experiences of working with them today to share with you some thoughts around changed ways of facilitating student learning in a virtual world. So that's me. Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Grace Ogoli. I'm an experienced practice educator and I'm a practice lead with one of the children's services. Yeah, I'm one of the panelists, and I just want to support in sharing some of my experience, challenges, difficulties in this virtual world kind of way of working now.
I think what's really interesting, Grace, is you were working with a student, weren't you, in, if you like, the old way of working, the ordinary way, and then we went into the pandemic. So you worked with one student in both ways, yes, which I think means you're going to bring a lot to today's conversations. So thank you for sharing today. And I know we'll have different practice educators join us in different webinars. Today is all about learning and the impact of the pandemic on learning. So I suppose what we're going to do is there's going to be a presentation. I'm going to ask you things I'd like you to put into the chat. Grace is going to contribute a localized view. So you are going to be able to access these slides after the session today. I'm quite happy for the slides to go onto the website or whatever Satvinder wants to do with the slides, but you'll be able to see the slides. So just in terms of a kind of background, I suppose, really, to what I think has been the most significant impact of COVID-19, I'm going to talk about pandemic practice because I don't know how else to talk about what we're doing at the moment, but I'm going to refer to it as pandemic practice. And I think the impact of COVID-19 has been very significant. There's been very change in policy and practice. I think that's actually been very difficult for students to get hold of, because just when they think they've got hold of something, the policy's changed again. So practice has been constantly changing during this time. Of course, there's been an increased isolation of students, of practice educators, of social workers, and of the people that we seek to support. So that's had a big impact. There's also, I think, perhaps one of the biggest impacts, and something we will talk quite significantly about today, is a lack of situated learning opportunities. And that really refers to that learning that takes place incidentally for students. When a student's sitting in an office and they just overhear conversations around them, or they listen into how somebody else makes a telephone call and think, oh, that was interesting, I'll try that next time. All of that's gone when people are working from home. There's also a lack of situated support, I think, for practice educators. And if you're working with a student who's struggling, for example, sometimes when a student's struggling, you might talk to your colleagues about the student and their perspectives of the student. But increasingly, we're losing that because the student isn't placed in the team with others. So there's a lot of situated learning, situated support that we're missing out on with new ways of working. A lot of us are now bringing social work into our own homes. It leads to the potential for moral injury, which is a concept I really want us to talk about today. And I want you to be able to have conversations about in the chat. A lot of people have also been homeschooling at the same time. I want you to think about, where is your working space? Think about, where is the student's working space? Think about, where is your reflective space? And practice educators have been talking to me about brain space and saying, I don't feel like I've got the brain space to work with a student. So there's lots of issues about space, the spaces, and we're going to talk about space today. And there's also general boundaries issues as well. So all of this is going on in the background. And today we're going to look at the impact of that on student learning in the second webinar, we're going to look at the impact of that on student supervision. And in the third webinar, we're going to look at the impact of that on the assessment of students and newly qualified workers. So we've got these 3 sessions looking at learning, supervision and assessment. So today is all about learning. And generally what I'm finding talking to people about their experiences during the pandemic, particularly students, is it's one of 2 things. Either students are feeling incredibly isolated and on their own. They don't have to have a neat bookshelf like that, you know, just to feel very isolated. Or on the other hand, what you've got is people are like that, trying to deal with everything, trying to look after everything that's going on at home. They've got all these different things working at the kitchen table, everything's flying on around them. And of course, that could relate to either the students or practice educators. You know, practice educators can feel either very isolated or like they're trying to juggle 1,000 things all at once. So the impact has been very significant of the pandemic. And of course, there's also the whole aspect of waves. We keep being told, you know, particularly at the beginning of all of this, politicians use this phrase regularly, as did celebrities, keep telling us we're all in the same boat. But actually, we know we're not all in the same boat. We might all be facing the same storms, the same waves, but we're all in very different boats. Some people are in like an armored tanked cruise liner like that, and some people are in a tiny little dinghy with a hole in it. What we know is that the pandemic exaggerates inequality, and we know that inequality is exaggerated by the pandemic. We've got this whole relationship with inequality and the pandemic. The situation is constantly changing because we're being told we're in a second wave, but how many waves are there going to be? And then there's also that constant change and waves of emotions that people feel, and the emotional context of practice learning, I think, has been very significantly impacted also in pandemic practice. So I think, Grace, you were wanting to say something on this slide. I'm not sure. Did you want to add something to what I was saying there? Are you muted, Grace? You need to unmute yourself. Oh, are you not? I'm on.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no. No, you're mute again. Grace, something's happened here. It was all working fine before.
Yeah, I'm on mute now. Yeah. I totally agree with you, Siobhan. I mean, we always use the phrase, we're all on the same boat. But for me, yes, we're all anxious when it happened, but I must say that we might be on the same boat. However, people manage things differently. For instance, a practice educator, a practice lead, experienced social worker, managers, because we're creative as social workers, we kind of adapt and we kind of strategize and develop coping mechanisms. For a student, I mean, and a newly qualified, they're coming into the profession. They want to learn the skill. And when I hear the term we're in the same boat, I kind of think, we're kind of in the same boat. However, there are different coping mechanisms because student wants to learn and they are not on the same boat with us. So for me, that's my take on it, that and I feel sorry for students sometimes when they hear the term we're on the same boat and they kind of don't want to say anything because they feel that we are all anxious and we're all struggling. So I'm not going to say anything because they would think I don't have that empathy or I don't understand. So I think we have to be aware of that we might be on the same boat. However, we're technically not on the same wavelength or whatever.
Absolutely, Grace. I agree with you. I think we're not in the same boat at all because we are, as you say, some people are very experienced and can be creative. And yeah, if you're very new to it, I just think to myself sometimes, gosh, if I was a student at the moment, I'd probably be getting seasick in this wave, you know, because there's just so much going on. There's so many difficulties. So I also think on top of the wave idea, is something about we're more than 6 months into this experience now. You know, when it was all starting off, it was very new for us, how we were working, how we were responding to the pandemic. I don't know if people are on Twitter, But if you followed Professor Ahmed's tweets about hitting a 6-month wall, and she talked about how you can hit a 6-month wall in, she said anything she's ever done, so any project she's ever done, she's always hit a 6-month wall. And she wrote a thread about it, which went viral, massively viral. But she was basically talking about how there's always going to be a 6-month wall. We can't carry on with difficulties and challenges without hitting a wall at some point. And I think recently a lot of social workers, a lot of practice educators have been hitting a wall a bit, really, because this crisis has been going on for so long. We thought it was going to be temporary. It seems like it's going to take longer now. For many years, I've talked about newly qualified workers having a 6-month dip. 6 months into the first year, they kind of take a dip in terms of confidence. So the 6-month thing, whether it's a dip or a wall, I think that's where we are now. We're at this real crucial stage of thinking about how do we do practice education in terms of pandemic practice, if you like. So it's a good time, I suppose, to be trying to launch online learning for the teaching partnership, to sort of launch things. So what we're going to be doing today to launch off the events is we're going to be thinking about the impact of pandemic practice on practice learning. We're going to think about the development of a learning curriculum. We're going to think about adult learning theory. We're also going to think about facilitating student learning and learning environments. So that's what I'm aiming to cover in the 2 hours that we've got together today. Please feel free to put any questions you want to into the chat, any comments that you have into the chat. I'm going to ask you about your experiences. Please put those into the chat, and Satvinder and Joe are going to feed those in at various points during the presentation. But we're going to start off by looking at a learning curriculum. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my perspectives on a learning curriculum, and then I think Grace is going to tell you about how she develops learning curriculums. So in terms of what a learning curriculum is, some people use that phrase and some people don't. Some people call it a learning plan. But essentially, a learning curriculum is really a plan of learning. What is the student going to learn and how are they going to learn it? So generally, really, a curriculum is going to start off with a student saying, these are my learning needs. And then you as a practice educator looking at how can I meet those needs in this placement setting. So a social work practice learning curriculum is basically a plan for the placement, and each curriculum should look different for each student. So you're going to have particular ways that you like to work with a student, but every student has a different starting point. Every student has a different experience. So what should we include in a practice learning curriculum? I think that the curriculum is more important now than it's ever been, because we almost need to be saying to a student, look, here is a plan. Don't panic. It's all going to happen. You're going to get there. Because if a student's just told, oh, don't worry, it's all going to come together. At the moment, things look so different. They don't see how it's going to come together. And having a plan that says, here's your learning needs. Here are the learning methods or the materials or the opportunities that we're going to use to facilitate your learning. And here's who's going to be responsible for that. So you'll be responsible for doing this. The practice educator will be responsible for that. Someone else on the team is going to share some responsibility. So it will show how the whole team around the student is going to support them. And it will link to the learning assessment criteria. So it'll link into the PCF or possibly the KSS. If they're not the specific learning needs, some programs, the student comes in saying, these are my learning needs around the particular standards, but not everybody does. So Grace, how do you do a curriculum with students? What are your thoughts?
As a PA, I always have a kind of set learning opportunities, which I always adapt to the student, because I always want to see their last placement, what their learning needs are, so I adapted to what I have already. However, I must say I was faced with great difficulty executing this, because my students started 3 weeks into the lockdown. So I started with my bright, lovely, fanciful learning opportunities, and then 3 weeks everybody had to go into lockdown. But what kept me was, because of we've done the induction, we had so much reading I've sent out to him, I kept in touch. Even though we were not sure at that point in my local authority how or when the placement would continue. But what I did was, like, it started with once every 2 days, but it went into weekly, fortnightly, to check on him to make sure, keep doing your reading. You're still a student technically. Just read this, read that, everything I sent him. So to keep up to his learning, in as much as we're not there. And then when they eventually came back, it was difficult, if I'm honest. It was difficult, but I had to, as social workers, as we know, we social workers adapt, be creative, think on our toes, we just get on with it. I had to adapt everything in the learning aid, because I know it's a virtual world, Siobhan, but everything in virtual, everything we do in the conventional world can be adapted to the virtual world. And that's what I did, to just find a way to do it virtually. And I have to say, the virtual world have enabled even the newly qualified to be more confident, think on their feet, hypothesize more, to be fair. And it put them in a kind of deep end to learn while you were there as a PE to catch them and then support them. So I quickly adapted for instance, like the physical home visit that I would have done, the shadowing. We had to say, how are we going to adapt it for you to do your learning? Like risk assessment changed, the way we do risk assessment, it all changed. So it's about the adaptation and thinking on our feet and supporting the student, whether or not they are there with you in the office. But I have to say, from my experience and what I saw, despite the difficulties initially, once we're into it, it's brilliant. We adapted to it. The student learned fast. Some of the worries were elevated because they were worried about not being with other people, but because of the setting of boarding them up with somebody who is experienced, they were able to do the work. So that's how I was able to manage that learning needs.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing about working from the learning needs, working from the students' learning needs, as you've said, and then adapting to the situation. See, my experience this time was very different to yours, Grace. You'd already started with the student, the induction had happened, and you went into lockdown. Whereas I was asked, look, we've got 5 students who need to do a virtual placement. And this was a couple of months into lockdown. And I was presented with, please, can you work with these 5 students? It will all be virtual. They can do their placement without leaving their bedroom, effectively. It didn't work out like that. In actual fact, they did go out, but they started off on the basis of they don't have to go out. They can do everything via, electronic means or whatever. So for me, I spent ages planning, how am I going to do this? How am I going to think about that? And I want to tell you in the next webinar about how all my planning went completely wrong. And I think there's an element of you just have to adapt in the moment, as you've said, Grace. So I will share some of that next time. But what I did go back to for myself when I was, I need to work with these 5 students, what I went back to was actually the basic keys of my role as a practice educator. And these go right back to actually to the days of SETSWA. I don't know how many of you are here that even remember what SETSWA was, but it was the Central Council for Education and Training in Social Work many, many years ago. And SETSWA said, when we used to be called practice teachers, and in those days, in the very early 1990s, then they said that practice educators' role was basically 3 things: theory and practice, reflective practice, anti-oppressive practice, and values. Over the years, because of experiences I've added on a 4th one: boundaries in practice. And what I tend to do is I tend to work on just those 4 areas, and then everything else kind of comes out of it. So when I'm planning things, I plan, how will I help them with theory and practice? How will I help with reflective practice? So I did that for this group of students doing a virtual placement. And there's a phrase that's often used in international social work, and the phrase is, a small key can open a very large door. And actually that can happen sometimes. I don't know your experience, Grace, but sometimes you get one little thing right with a student and everything can move from there, can't it? That small key opens everything. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through those 4 keys. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about theory and practice. I'm going to talk about reflective practice, anti-oppressive practice, and boundaries, but look at what impact has the pandemic had. So I'm going to talk you through that. Then we're going to go back to looking at the learning environment, and then we're going to talk to Grace again about the issues that Grace has experienced during the pandemic. But in terms of theory and practice, The first thing that I'm going to say to you is this is always a challenge. You don't have to have a pandemic for practice educators to feel like theory and practice is challenging them. You ask a student, what theory are you using there? And they look back at you like that, like a rabbit caught in the headlights. It's like, terrible. You've asked me this terribly frightening question. I don't know. So what I would say to you is, in my view, actually working with students on theory has actually become almost easier during the pandemic in many ways, because there's loads of resources that have been made available that weren't available beforehand. So, for example, I have a website called socialworkconnect.com, which is a subscription website that's all about theory and reflection. I've made that free to students during the pandemic and to student practice educators as well. So if any of you are doing the course at university, your PEPS course, and all they have to do is email me and they get access to that for free at the moment. It was initially till September, but because we're going into another lockdown, I extended it for a period of time. And that will help students apply theory to their practice. So you as a practice educator can set them some exercises and activities on that website that then is their learning opportunity, and they bring evidence to you. So that wasn't available for everybody before, but it is now. There's a series of webinars that I've been doing on a Wednesday night. So I started some webinars that just looked at theory and reflection on a Wednesday night. We've now done 21 webinars. Joe, who introduced things and is chairing today, Joe did a webinar with me last week. So those Wednesday night webinars, they're free to attend. We get between 408 to 900 people attending each week. They're really popular. They're available for students. They were never there before. YouTube, there's a lot of new YouTubers. In the past, last year, if you'd have tried to look up social work theory on YouTube, you'd have just got lots of American stuff. Now there's loads of social workers who've set up. Shabnam Ahmed, who is also in London. I don't know which part of London, Joe. I'm just looking, Joe's nodding. But Shabnam has set up a YouTube site looking at supervision. So I don't know if Joe can maybe put that into the chat so people can go there. There's a newly qualified, a fairly young social worker. She's not newly qualified, but Kaylee Rose Evans has set up a YouTube channel, which is really good, looks at loads of issues for young social workers. I've set up a YouTube channel which is all about theory and practice. So there's loads of stuff out there now that you can direct students to new things, I suppose is what I'm saying to you. And I'd also suggest that there are lots of opportunities to think through the theory that's specific to working in the pandemic. So things like narrative approaches, death making, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, crisis intervention. I did a webinar specifically about theory that related to the pandemic, and that's available to watch back on YouTube. So there's loads and loads of stuff out there now that wasn't there before, and I would encourage you to look at all of that. I would also suggest there are activities like this that I've used these activities for a long time, but they're really engaging with students at the moment. So I use an activity that I call developing a theory tree with students. When I'm working with students, I ask them to look at what approaches do you like to use in social work, what theories, what models, what methods, and I help them to separate it out and create their own tree so that they can learn from that. So I'll ask them things, what kind of approaches do you like to use as a practitioner? What theories do you generally draw on to understand what's happening? What models do you use to intervene? And what methods come out of those? And then once the student develops their tree, they have their own roots in practice, and you can really see their growth in terms of learning about theory and practice. Again, I did a webinar about this. I think if you're looking for the webinars, this one would be webinar number 17. So I did a webinar about exercises that you could use as a practice educator to help students with theory and practice. Again, this is something you can watch back. It was incredibly popular, but since then we've had so many tweets. Now this is a tweet, and I've asked him for permission to share this with you today, but this is a tweet just from a student. I've never met this student, and he's locked in. He was locked in during lockdown, and he said he wanted to develop his own theory tree during lockdown, and there it is. It's the photograph he stuck on Twitter. Obviously he's put it on his bed. What I'm trying to show you here is if we can still maintain students with a practical hands-on activity, even though we're effectively distanced from them, it can keep you socially connected. You can be physically distanced, but socially connected. So helping students to take a more self-directed approach to thinking about theory is really important. And, you know, we could do a whole 2-hour webinar on helping students with theory and practice, and we can't because that's not the topic for today. But I wanted to say to you, there's a lot of stuff available out there for you to consider theory and practice. In many ways, the pandemic has actually helped us in this area, because before those resources weren't available, but now they are. So just a final thing I think about theory is just to remind us all about crisis theory, because this is a crisis. This is a global crisis, and we're working through a global crisis. Maclean first wrote about crisis in the 1960s, so, you know, a long time ago now, but it's still very relevant today. And he said crises have 3 phases to them. So it's like a staged theory where he talked about 3 stages to a crisis. First of all, he says there's an impact stage, the initial impact. Then there's a recoil stage. I always think of the recoil as being a kind of, you step back because you kind of almost don't know what to do, so you recoil from the crisis. And then the third stage is adjustment and adaptation. Now, I think you could take that theory of crisis and think about your own response to the pandemic. I can tell you about my response. So my oldest daughter lives in China. I feel like this has been part of our lives as a family for a long time. We were aware of it at Christmas, and we were talking about it really from the end of December onwards. And I'd got to the point where in January, February, I was talking to my daughter every day because I was so worried. So I thought when it hit over here, I'd be prepared for it. I'd know about it. You know, it didn't take me by surprise. And yet still the impact was huge. And I can remember that, you know, the big impact hitting and everything shutting down. And I think I did recoil. I think I did effectively almost become paralyzed in my work, because I was thinking, how am I ever going to do training again? I like to be very interactive in my training. I'd always been very critical of online approaches to training. And I kind of thought, I can't do that. But over the time, I've adapted and I've adjusted, and I am delivering things online now. And I adapted the way that I work with students, and things are working okay. Grace talked earlier about how we adapt and how Grace changed working with that student, the initial impact, you not knowing when the student was going to come back. That's almost the recoil stage. You maintained contact through all of that time, and then you adjusted and adapted, and everything went really smoothly when the student was back on placement. So I think we can look at this stages of crisis to think about how we're responding. Since Maclean first wrote it in the 1960s, lots of people have written more about those 3 stages of crisis, but they tend to talk about the final stage differently. So rather than talking about adjustment and adaptation, they tend to talk about reorganization, recovery, or reimagining. And I think this is the point where we do need to reimagine traditional ways of doing practice education. We do need to look to reorganize ourselves as practice educators. And I'm hoping that today will start you off with some ideas of that based on my experiences and Grace's experiences. So I just wanted to start us off by saying, you know, theory and practice, it's a big issue, always has been. And actually, that's got easier during the pandemic because there's so much more available to us. And we'll make sure that you get links to all of the resources that I've mentioned, because they're all free, they're all freely available. So I don't know if there's anything in the chat at the moment, Joe, that I need to know about, or if there's any questions that people have.
Yeah, sorry. One of the debates was around the terminology. So perhaps the difference or not between the term virtual or remote practice learning. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a really interesting discussion because, you know, was virtual implying that everything was simulated? Mm-hmm. So maybe, you know, it was a discussion that a particular person raised.
It's very interesting, and it's one that I'm going to come back to. I've got some slides about that later, so I kind of almost anticipated that would come up as a question because it's a really good one. So we will come back to that. So,
and the other thing, people are interested in your Wednesday seminars, or you'll find
Right, okay.
so we've just been putting details of how to access in the chat. But I would encourage attendees. I know you're trying to listen to Siobhan as well, but do feel free to add your comments and thoughts, because yes, Siobhan's got lots of ideas for us, but I know that you've all got really good ideas as well. So it's really useful to share what you have done, what you could do in this current situation, or perhaps in the old world, things that work really well with students. So, don't be shy. Do share all your fantastic ideas.
Absolutely. Put down anything, any suggestions you've got, any thoughts you have in the chat, because we can then share those later as well. And often the chat is a really rich source of learning. I know the Wednesday night webinars that I do, we send out the chat with the certificate and the email afterwards, because people really enjoy learning from each other in the chat. So please do use the chat and put in there any thoughts and suggestions you have. So we've looked at theory. I'm going to look at now the second key of practice education, from my perspective at least, which is reflective practice. So as that second key of reflection, I suppose from my perspective, it's perhaps in relation to the reflective practice key that we see how actually all four of those keys are vital for everyone in social work. It's not just about students. We need to encourage students to develop reflective practice skills, but we need to be reflexive in our own approach, as is demonstrated in the Practice Educator Professional Standards. Every single social work standard, so there's loads of them, Social Work England standards, the KSS, the post-qualifying standards for supervisors, all of the different standards all refer to reflection in practice. It's the one thing that ties every social work standard together, is reflection. So reflection is key and really important. And of course, if you've not yet done your Social Work England CPD, remember that's really important. You need to get it in. I'm feeling really smug because I got mine done the week before last, so I feel really smug now because it's kind of done. But even though it's done, I'm still going to start to load up new CPD ready for next time, because we should be loading up CPD at least once a quarter, really. So reflective practice, I'm going to take you through a couple of things about reflection. I want to talk about the steps of reflection. Then I want to talk about the stages of reflection and the impact of the pandemic on the stages. But the key thing that I really want to focus in on in today's webinar is the spaces of reflection and the big impact that the pandemic has had on those spaces. So in terms of the steps of reflection in social work, we use the phrase reflective practice, as I have, as this key, but we use that phrase to cover three separate but connected components of reflection, critical reflection, and reflexivity. And if you look at the standards, if you look at the professional capabilities framework, you look at the knowledge and skills statements, it's clear that really what we're looking for is, at the end of a first placement, a student should be consistently reflective in their practice, but they need to continue to develop so that by the end of a final placement, the point of qualification, they're consistently critically reflective in their practice. And by the end of an ASYE year, they're consistently reflexive with an X. Now, I've done quite a lot of work on this and what the difference between these is. Again, if you're interested, we can direct you to a YouTube video that I did that's about half an hour long that really explains this in depth. But to do it very quickly, because we don't have the depth today, just to clarify what we mean by each of those steps. And if you wanted to look for this, if you want to, rather than just say Siobhan said, if you want, I don't know if you're doing an assignment in your PEPs or something and you want to reference this, the best place to look, the most recent place, is the knowledge and skills, it's the post-qualifying standards for adult social work supervision, Department of Health and Social Care 2018. In the glossary there, they talk about this. And they're very clear. It's probably the best place I've ever seen written about the clarity of the difference here. So reflection, we all think we know what reflection is, but essentially reflection is about thinking actively and persistently. It's about exploring thoughts that we have, developing new knowledge and insights. It's about our feelings and our emotions and what we've learned. It's not something we just do with hindsight. That's something we'll look at in a moment. So it should be happening all of the time, reflection. Then critical reflection, as we would expect a student as they're developing to then become critically reflective. A lot of the time when you add the word critical on, people think, oh, that means then looking at something that didn't go very well. That's the critical. But actually, when we add the word critical in, it means that we add in issues of considering power and the socio-political context. That's the key thing that makes reflection become critical reflection. It's really about bringing together critical theory and reflection. Think about critical race theory, for example. Critical race theory is all about where does power lie in relation to race and ethnicity. Critical theory, it's all that theory about Marxism and power. You know, it's all the power stuff. So when we add in critical reflection, it means that we bring in a consideration of power dynamics, anti-oppressive practice issues, the socio-political context, and we go into enough depth to bring about meaningful change. So we take reflection, we add in issues of power, the socio-political context, we go into more depth. That becomes critical. Then when we take it on to the final stage of reflexivity, reflexivity takes everything that came before, because at each step we take what came before and we add to it. And reflexivity originally comes from research. That's where it comes from. And so it's very relevant to us as practice educators. We should take a reflexive approach to working with students, because really we're researching the quality of a student's practice. We are researchers. Social workers are researchers in practice. So it's relevant that it comes from research. And in research, the word reflexivity is all about research which sees the interconnectedness and interconnected nature. So reflexivity is where we look at relationships and connections that aren't always immediately apparent. If critical reflection is taking critical theory and adding that to reflection, then reflexivity is taking systems thinking and adding that to reflection. So this is systemic reflection. It's thinking about the systems, the connections, the interconnections in people's lives. And the final thing that reflexivity does is it adds in the centrality of self. It's all about understanding yourself. So whereas a reflective question might be what happened, what went well, what didn't go well. A reflexive question is what impact did I have on that family? And what impact did that work have on me? That's that circularity of self-awareness and relationships and connectedness. So it's taking it into a lot more depth, but it's adding in the use of self. So I just wanted to remind us of that. What are we looking for with students? How do we maintain that movement towards reflexivity? And one thing I've noticed during the pandemic, on lots of layers, not just with the students that I worked with, but during training, and I'm doing a lot of work with new workers as well, is that there is more self-awareness at the moment. And I wonder if some of that is because we have to think about ourselves in the pandemic, but also we're looking at ourselves on camera ever such a lot of the time. I never used to look at myself. Now I'm looking at myself on camera all of the time. So there's that bit about you become more aware of how people see you, and self-awareness becomes clearer for people. So that's the steps of reflection, but I want to look at the stages of reflection to just remind you of this. This is stuff you know. Everybody knows about Schoen's work, reflecting in action, the reflection we do in the moment while something's happening. And reflection on action is the reflection we do later, looking back. Now, you see, I think as a trainer, there's been a big impact of the pandemic already, because I can't reflect in action the way I used to. If I was in a room with all of you, I'd be looking around the room, I'd be gauging the atmosphere, I'd be thinking about what do I need to change. That's very difficult. I'm just talking at my computer screen and all I can see is Joe's face and Grace's face. So I don't have that same sensory information to work off. But the third stage of reflection, and the one I think has had the most impact from the pandemic, is added later by Killian and Toddenham in the 90s. They used the same phrasing as Shern had because it had been so popular, but they said he'd missed a bit. And the bit they said he'd missed, they called it reflection for action. Now, that's the reflection that we do before a piece of work. So the reflection we do while we're planning for something. So effectively, what we should have is 3 stages of reflection: before, during, and after. So we have reflection for action, in action, on action. If you like, what we do is we create a plan, do, review, cycle of reflection. So this is just reminding you and refreshing you about things that you already know. But I do think reflection for action has been previously missing. We've not done that enough. I think sometimes social workers don't do enough reflection for action. They just kind of get into stuff and do it. You know, they get a referral, oh, I'll just go off and do. I think during the pandemic, we've become more reflection for, we've thought about things more. We've been more reflective before doing things because, as Grace said earlier, we now have to do risk assessments before we can go out. Our routinized ways of working have been challenged very significantly. So I think people are now, certainly at the start of the pandemic, they were talking more about reflection for action. Whereas previously, I think it was really only people who were new to a role that had a lot of time to reflect for action. So we really need to think about, are we allowing students and new workers and new practice educators to reflect for action? Are we allowing that space? Because we know that failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's a word we don't want to use in practice learning, really. So we know we need to spend more time in that planning stage. But all of this about reflection is leading me to what I think is one of the key things at the moment that I'd really like to talk to you about. And if we were able to have microphones on, I'd really want to talk to you. So I really want you to use the chat function when I start to talk to you about moral injury. This is something that is so important during this pandemic, but it all comes out of reflection, and it links into this need to reflect with others. So Joe and Prospero Tedham and I wrote a new model for practice education called Share, and within that we talked about the importance of reflecting with others. And we talked about how it's really important for a practitioner to have the space and the time to be with other people when reflecting, to be able to sound out their ideas, to have that kind of being in a team room and just sounding things out with people. Well, of course, we know that's been impacted. We know that already. We need to think about the spaces of reflection. Where are we reflecting? So we know about the importance of space because we take a person and environment perspective, as that illustration shows. We want to think about the social worker in the context of their team and the local authority and the university. And so we have to see all of the context, and that's really important. Over many years, I have done lots of training on reflective practice. And before the pandemic, I would do this training face to face, and I'd say to people, where do you reflect? And there were 3 spaces they would tell me. Number 1, the car. Number 2, the bathroom. And number 3, bed. The most popular spaces of reflection. Now, on the screen in front of you, there's a question there for you that I'd like you to put into the chat. Where is your reflective space? And how has that changed since the pandemic? Where do you reflect? Because where social workers would say, I would reflect in the car, or sometimes people would say I'd reflect on public transport, or that's gone a lot now. We're not driving as much. We're not going between visits as much anymore. We're expected to go from one meeting to another on Teams and then move to another meeting. And then there's no time for what Harry Ferguson refers to as transitional spaces in social work. And this is really important. At the beginning of the pandemic, Harry Ferguson wrote a really interesting blog that's freely available on Research in Practice, where he speculated that social workers would need to find what he described as new thinking spaces. I would say reflective spaces. He called them thinking spaces. And he said that they would need to be around the transitional spaces, around that movement between things. Transitioning, if you like, from being a social worker to being a colleague is what we're doing, or being because we hold so many different roles as social workers. How do we transition from aspects of the different roles? So he says this reflective space, this thinking space, we've got to put a lot of time and thought into. I want you to think about your reflective space, and are you still able to reflect there, or has it changed since the pandemic? And then I want you to think about if you're working from home. I want us to take a trauma-informed perspective of this and recognize the way, what we know is that trauma and space are connected. We know that if people have experienced trauma, spaces can remind them of that trauma. We know space and trauma are connected as social workers, but generally in society, they know space and trauma are connected. You know, that phrase that gets used, do you remember where you were when such and such a thing happened? It's kind of everybody knows about the connection between trauma and space. And we are now taking social work into our own homes. And we need to think about, how do we stop it from, and this is a phrase that's been used by a number of social workers, intruding or infecting our safe spaces, our home as our safe space. How do we stop the trauma coming into our homes? How do we avoid secondary trauma impacting on our families and our support networks at home? Because we're now taking that trauma out of our professional space into our personal space. And I believe strongly that our employers as social workers, our social work educators, have a responsibility to support us in creating emotionally safe, reflective working spaces. And I think that's more important now than it has ever been. And I feel really strongly about this. And at the start of the pandemic, I read an article about moral injury, and I got so interested in it. I started writing about it, blogging about it. And I've been doing a lot of work with local authorities on this area. And I get 10 emails a day about moral injury. So I'm going to tell you a bit about moral injury. I'm going to give you some examples. And I do want you to feel able, because this is a safe space, I want you to feel able in the chat to talk about, does this ring true for you? Is this something you've heard of? I mean, have you heard of moral injury before? Is this something that rings true? So moral injury is a phrase that's taken from the military. It's used internationally. And in the military, it's a phrase that's used to refer to the psychological distress that results from taking actions, or perhaps a lack of actions, that violates someone's moral code. Now, I think in social work, we wouldn't talk about morals, we'd talk about ethics, our ethical code. So I did wonder for a while, shall I call this ethical injury instead of moral injury? But this is a widely known phrase. Moral injury is used in lots of different professional groups all over the world. So I don't want to change it. I'm not fiddling about with something that's a concept that everybody knows about. And in an article in the British Medical Journal that I read February time, I think, which was speculating about the impact of the pandemic on healthcare professionals, Greenberg et al. Said, and this is their words, they said that healthcare professionals would be likely to experience significant moral injury during the pandemic because of three things. They said because healthcare professionals would need to think about how to allocate scant resources to what they described as equally needy patients, because they would need to think about how to balance their own physical and healthcare needs with those of their patients. And they would need to make decisions about how to align their duty of care towards patients with their duty towards their own family and support networks. And when I read that, I was captured by it, because I thought, do you know, this is what we do as social workers all the time. We don't need a pandemic to be struggling with how do we allocate scant resources. We don't need a pandemic to think about how do we balance our need for self-care with the fact that we care for other people. These are things that we're dealing with all of the time, and they've just been exaggerated by the pandemic. So I started to research it, got really interested in it. There's very little written about moral injury in social work. There's a couple of articles in America, but very little written about it. But this is what I've kind of gathered. So in many ways, it is similar to concepts that we're already familiar with. So things like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, even stress and burnout. But as practice educators, we would not expect students to experience those things as students or newly qualified workers. They're the kinds of things you think people experience when they've been in the job a while. And yet students and new workers are experiencing moral injury constantly at the moment. We do know from research that people who develop moral injuries are likely to experience negative thoughts about themselves or others, and that feelings of shame, guilt, or disgust are common amongst people who experience moral injury. We know it's going to impact on practice. It's definitely impacting on morale. For example, you can look at national figures demonstrate that local authorities reported that sickness rates among social workers were at the lowest levels that they'd been for many years at the start of the pandemic. There was almost like a fight mode that people went into, and yet now that fatigue is hitting. That's changing. We know it's impacting on morale. We know it's impacting on practice, and it's likely, there isn't research, but just in my own thinking and the work I've been doing, I think it's likely to negatively impact on analysis, decision-making skills, and other core practice skills. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of moral injury. These are all real. These are all things that people have told me about. They're not from your area. And I have permission to share them, but please don't share them, widely, because they might relate to someone that you know or work with. So, but these, I have permission to share all of these. The first one is an example from a student. So it's early in the pandemic. She was working from home. She was trying to homeschool her children at the same time. She was on placement. And this is the moment that she described, and I think most people can identify with it. She said, I'm sitting at my kitchen table working. I've got the computer and she had a headset on, much like I think it was Daniel that had the headset on earlier. So she had a headset on. She was taking a call as part of her placement, and her children were playing in the back garden. Patio doors are open so she can watch her children playing. She was at a pivotal moment on this safeguarding telephone call, she said. And to add another layer, her practice educator was observing this via Teams as part of her portfolio. So it was one of the direct observations of practice. And she said a son fell over in the garden and he started to cry. And in that moment, the mum in her wanted to run outside, pick her son up, kiss the knee better. The social worker in her thought, I'm at a really pivotal moment of this call and I really need to stay with it because this person's moving into a new understanding. And the student in her thought, I've got to pass this direct observation. What you can see is she was split into so many different aspects of her role because we're carrying all of those roles at the same time. We didn't used to. If her son had fallen over when he was at school, she wouldn't have ever known about it. But the fact is that we're there in that moment. It's all happening at once. So that's a very simple but clear example that many people can identify with. Another one is of a newly qualified social worker who was a single mum. I don't want to give all the examples involving children, so I'll try not to, but this is a very relevant one, I think. So a newly qualified social worker, she's a single mum. She said, my role hasn't changed much since the pandemic. Actually, most of my work has always been on the phone. She works on a mental health team. She does the crisis line. So she deals with the calls that come into the crisis team. And she said she's been specifically trained on asking some very detailed, very hard-hitting questions. So she'll say to people, do you have a plan to take your own life? What is your plan? And she said, I might even ask things like, and have you made a noose yet? She said, I might ask even really detailed questions like that. She said she's provided with a headset so that people around her can't hear what the service user is saying, but that doesn't stop them hearing what she is saying in return. And she said she has to pick her daughter up at 3:30 from school. There was no after school childcare at the beginning of the pandemic. Daughter was still in school, but no childcare outside of school. She spoke to a team manager and a team manager said, you can take a late lunch to go and pick your daughter up. That's okay. But then she said to a manager, But I don't want my daughter, who is 6 years old, listening to me asking these kinds of questions. I don't, she's 6 years old. I don't want her to hear me saying, what's the plan for taking your own life? Can I do the calls up until 3:30, and then can I do admin afterwards and someone else take those calls? I think that's a perfectly reasonable request, because to me, that's an example of the trauma of social work impacting on our personal lives and our family. But there's a clear example. A manager did not facilitate that. Now, to me, that's something that we need to think about. How do we facilitate students we're working with working at home with children? How do we do that? Or working at home with other people? And then the final one I'm going to share with you is a team manager, but it could equally have been a practice educator. It just wasn't. And I'm just going to tell you this is how it happened. But imagine this was a practice educator, because it equally could have been. So this is a team manager doing supervision with a social worker via Teams. So, just on computer screen. And she said supervision's going fine. But then behind the social worker, the door opens and a man comes in. And he's wrapped just in a towel or something. I thought it was going to be a funny story about, he didn't know he was there or something. But he started to shout at the woman, the social worker, and she said, please leave, I'm in a meeting. So he did leave, but he came back a few minutes later and he shouted more, and he started to throw things at the social worker. And there was a clear example of this was domestic abuse taking place in front of the team manager's eyes. Now, there's moral injury there on so many levels, in so many layers. And this is because we're starting to do things in our own homes. So this whole element of what's the trauma that you're taking with you into your own homes? How are you considering this for yourself, for your colleagues, and for students? So to me, moral injury is incredibly relevant and something that as practice educators, we need to talk about, we need to be aware of. So I've given you some really difficult, challenging, negative examples, but there is good news about moral injury. When you research moral injury and you look at the factors that can mitigate the impact of the injury, it's very clear. There are 6 things that are said to mitigate the impact or potentially prevent moral injury. One is team working and a sense that you belong to a strong community of practice. Another is a strong reflective culture. Good quality, emotionally supportive and reflective supervision. The opportunity for in-depth reflection with a particular focus on feelings and emotions. Education about the potential of moral injury and a permission to talk about and explore the depth of any injury with colleagues. And a clear recognition of the importance of your role and value being placed on that. And the good news is that this is all stuff that practice educators can do. But it's stuff that we need to think about, and we need to understand why we're doing it. So a lot of students have said during the pandemic, they have felt like they have been seen as a burden, that they're being seen as, oh, we can't provide a placement. What on earth can we do with you at the moment? And students are being made to feel like they're not just they lack importance, but that actually they are a burden on teams. We need to recognise the value that students bring. Even during a pandemic, students bring great value to teams. And we have to be able to help students to recognise that. So all of these things we can do, and they are really important. But moral injury is something students will experience, but you will experience, your team colleagues will experience. And I find that sometimes this isn't something you don't know about. You know about this. It's just given a phrase to describe something that we know is occurring. And I think it can be helpful to people to have that phrase because it gives permission to talk about it. So I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I was trying to encourage people to put things into the chat about their experiences of moral injury. But Joe, I don't know if there's any questions or anything in the chat. Or Satvinder, there is a question in the Q&A. I don't know if that's for me, but if you could have a quick look at that just to see, that would be helpful. So Joe, is there anything in the chat that people wanted to say?
I think the kind of reflective spaces that people may have had pre-COVID have definitely been impacted, but it's positive to note that some people have made new reflective spaces. So someone's now in this garden shed, I hope it's warm, but trying to find a different kind of space. But I guess what I was thinking about was, you know, not everyone has a garden shed or has a lot of, you know, can have space in their house that is only for work. I mean, especially, you know, especially in London where house prices are very expensive. So that's really the main discussion. And just these things can be compounded by inequality. So I guess the question is, how can we find new spaces or make better use, if that's the right word, of the spaces we have? So I was complaining that I used to kind of use the journey home on London public transport as my kind of processing the events of the day, recognising that I'm working in the university setting, so the things I have to process obviously are not like social work. And I suppose what I have found difficult is that I'm moving from my computer in my bedroom downstairs, and I'm still processing, and then my son's saying, "You haven't made me my dinner." So I guess other people in the chat have said that they've, you know, had issues around children needing their attention and they're not able to give it. In terms of moral injury, there hasn't been a great deal on that. I don't know if people want to comment on that. So the question I asked was, do you think this has resonance for social work? Can you kind of recognise kind of some of these incidences, if I can use that term? But I appreciate it's a very personal thing to discuss in this forum where we don't know each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Vinda, was the question for me, or was it a tech question?
It was about, is there time for reflection? Do we have enough reflective spaces? I think some other conversation in the chat was around keeping connected with your team, having virtual coffees, virtual lunches. I personally, the tube was a place of reflection for me. And I try and take more breaks. I spend more time in my garden instead of just looking out the kitchen window. I actually go out there and just try and make it feel more structured, so it doesn't feel like I'm just stuck in my living room, for taking regular breaks.
Yeah. And I guess the winter is perhaps a challenge for all of us that we might have done. So I might have been quite happy to go for a little walk. You know, when it's raining and dark, I'm not so inclined. And the other thing I wanted to say was that maybe it's not connected, but something in what you were saying made me think about that. I've seen some comments on Twitter, perhaps from practitioners, or they were from practitioners, being quite disparaging about different sorts of arrangements for placements or students working for home. And I think those comments are kind of, you know, they're not helpful for students, are they? You know, you don't want a group of people saying, well, your placement wasn't as good enough as mine. And so I think, you know, I sometimes choose to ignore it. Sometimes I choose to engage with it.
I do think that's very relevant. And I suppose it links into this moral injury, really. If you're telling people, oh, well, your placement's not of value, and actually, you know, you're not going to be an equipped social worker, or it's not helping people at all in terms of this. Yeah.
And what's the alternative? You know, we can't, students have to do some sort of placement. And I mean, even if, you know, and, you know, that students are going to reflect the realities we're all facing, isn't it? That, you know, maybe we're one day in the office, or we're rotating who's in the office, and the rest of the time, perhaps we're at home. So we need to give a realistic experience of what it's like for students. So if this is what it's like currently, that you're not going to be in a physical office space, then this is what students have to, you know, we can't protect the students from what might happen when they qualify in, you know, June or something.
Absolutely. And we are going to come on and look at that, because it is such an important point that you're raising, Jo. Grace, is there anything about moral injury that you wanted to say? I mean, does it ring true for you, thinking about it?
For me, it's a, I don't know how to put it, kind of battle that my take is sometimes people don't even recognize that it's moral injury. They don't even recognize it. That's the thing, because for some newly qualified students, they just want to get the job done. And for them, it's like, I need to do this to look good. It doesn't matter what I'm going through. And sometimes they don't speak up. And for me, is that the way I do manage, given the way we work now, I just tell them that you need to look after yourself and your family. Because for me, the kind of work we do in children's services and in social work as a whole, we're supporting is mental. I said, if you are not well or you're not okay, you can do the job. You fall sick, depression, mental health, it's real. And it's about, I mean, this slide is really very helpful for me, and I'm going to talk about it more in my team meeting. It's creating that awareness that there's moral injury. End of. But people, what I've seen in working so far is they don't even recognize it's there. For them is I just have to get this done. It doesn't matter if somebody. I've seen people whereby out of conversation, it was like, actually, my child is admitted. And I said, why are you doing that work? I have to do this. I have this deadline. I said, no, you need to go home. Somebody else. And I used to scare them by saying, if something happened to you today, that seat will be replaced with tomorrow. As simple as that. So it's creating that awareness, and as practice educator, practice teachers, managers, helping them to recognize that and to speak up and to know that it's about balancing and not thinking that you are a superhuman being and doing the work. Technically, you are supporting people and changing people's lives, but your life you're battling with some issues. Do you understand? So for me, it's about more awareness and recognizing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as you say, Grace, kind of a permission to talk about it, and a practice educator talking to a student about it, because students might not want to raise that this is occurring for them because they feel vulnerable by doing that. So absolutely, being able to talk about this is important. So we've looked at theory, we've looked at reflection, and they, I suppose moral injury comes in terms of spaces of reflection. The other two keys we don't have time to spend as much time on, but I did want to still reference them and still say it's really important for us to recognise issues around anti-oppressive practice and values at the moment. One thing I would say is that I do think recently the learning opportunities around this have been incredibly significant. Thinking about exploring, the murder of George Floyd and what occurred then, the pandemic of racism, as that's a pandemic that we've been living with for a long time, and talking about that. I think we know that crisis always exaggerates inequality. I've definitely noted from students that I'm working with more critical thinking from students and a keener awareness on the values in practice. And I don't know why that is, but definitely just recently I've noticed much more work on that, much more awareness on that. And I would just say to you, there's a few things that you might want to direct students towards or think about for yourself. IFSW, the International Federation of Social Workers, has done quite a lot of work on the ethical dilemmas created by COVID. And you can look at that on the IFSW website. There are some specific COVID related resources. There was a really good, they called it a magazine, but really to me it was a journal, but it was a short term 5 editions of a magazine called Social Work 2020 COVID-19, which is held at Sheffield University. It's full of peer reviewed articles. There's loads of really interesting stuff in there, particularly around values issues. And also BASWA did a thinking paper very early in the pandemic and talked about what they called slow ethics and ethical vigilance that we all need to be employing during the pandemic, because we're being asked to respond in such quick fire, rapid kind of knee-jerk ways. We need to think about slowing down ethical practice, really. So there's stuff there for people to look at. There's a variety of learning opportunities. And in terms of boundaries, I would just say that I found boundaries more fluid with new ways of working. And I think, therefore, we need to think about how do we teach boundaries more clearly. There are exercises I used to use in the past that I've found very useful, and I've pulled them out again for this year, just because I think boundaries are changing. I've noticed, social workers will say things like, certainly at the start of the pandemic, that service users would say, and how are you and your family? Are you keeping safe? There was a lot more sort of exchange of that. The fact, I know I was talking to a social worker the other day who said that she'd phoned a daughter up about a care plan, and a 2-year-old son threw himself on the floor, and she described him as having like this huge tantrum that was just so massive, and this carer could hear it and said, you get off and phone me again later. So she did, and then she phoned the carer back later, and then the carer of course said, well, oh, how is your son, how old is your son? And she said, I felt like it was stuff I wouldn't normally share, but I felt it was really difficult in that moment to not share something. And there's that bit about what are the boundaries, and the fluidity of the boundaries are very different, I think, at the moment. I've met one of the students I worked with had an issue with 1 day a week, she couldn't get any childcare. She had a 3-year-old daughter, and we decided we would do supervision on that day because she could work from home, have a daughter there, and we'd start off supervision. The daughter would pop up on screen, I would say hello, I'd ask the daughter to go and do me some drawings or something. The daughter would go off and do it. At the end of supervision, she'd come back and show me the drawings. I would never have engaged a child in supervision previously, but we had to do that. We had to adapt, and it worked. But I suppose what I'm saying is I've met social workers' children, I've met their dogs, I've met their cats, there've been so many blurring of boundaries. There's one student I worked with, and I said to her at the end, I think I've been in every room of your house except the bathroom, because every supervision she did in a different room. You wouldn't know normally what wallpaper people have got. There's a whole range of the boundaries are blurring. And so because of that, we've got to help students to learn where the boundaries lie and how boundaries lie. So I just would say I'd encourage you to think about that. So I've talked about the 4 keys of my approach to practice education. But, if you think about, I said to you, these have been around since the days of SETS, where I've used these keys for 25 or so years. And yet they relate really clearly to the PCF domains, don't they? Theory and practice is the knowledge domain. Reflective practice is the critical reflection and analysis domain. You've got anti-oppressive practices all in the impact super domain, the purpose super domain. So these sit, and the boundaries sits in the professionalism domain. So these are very closely connected with the PCF. So the question that was asked earlier about this virtual word, the virtual placement that Joe was saying there was a bit of a debate about, I want to just kind of return to that now. That I was asked to work with students doing a virtual placement, and it threw me because I was thinking, well, does that mean they're not really doing a placement then? It's just a nearly placement, because to me the word virtual was really quite a struggle to get a hold of. So I went back to one of the key things that I've used throughout my whole social work career, which is the what, why, how framework. And I use this constantly. So as a social worker, I would be thinking, going to see a service user, I would be thinking about in my assessment, looking at what's happening for this person. Then I'd be looking at why is it happening and how can I work with the person to bring about improved outcomes. I'm always looking at what, why, how. It's been key to, in a way, my curriculum planning. What does the student need to learn? Why is that important? How will I help them learn it? I've always used what, why, how. And one of the reasons I've loved working as a practice educator is because students have asked why. Why do you do it like that, Siobhan? It just makes me think, because I've done it like that for 20 years. If a student says, why do you do it like that? It keeps your practice fresh. But I've noticed well before the pandemic, I'd say maybe the last 5 or 6 years or so, I've noticed the why question is falling off the agenda more. And I think social workers now are doing a bit of a what's happened, how do I deal with it? What's going on? How do I respond? And we lose the why. When we lose the why, there's a real danger. Firstly, it becomes very managerialist, very proceduralized practice, but perhaps more dangerously, it's a medical model way of working. Because the medical model has always been, what's the diagnosis? How do we treat it? Social work brings the why in. And when we lose the why, we lose professional curiosity. We lose everything that we hold dear as social workers. So this framework, what, why, how, is really important. And I always say to students, always ask why, constantly ask why, because it's the most powerful question we can ever ask, really, is asking why. And students say they feel like, I can't ask why, it's a silly question. I feel like I should know the answer. And so if I ask why, it says I don't know something. But why is so important and very powerful. So as I said, for me, this has been one of the key methods I've used in developing a curriculum with students, what, why, how. And if you think about it, through our career, and even in when I was being asked to go into this virtual world, which I'll tell you a bit about how it worked, but for me, what social work is and why we do it stays the same. I've been a social worker 30 years. I did a 4-year course as it was in those days. And in those 34 years, what I think social work is and why I do it has never changed. How I do it, where I do it, who employs me, what forms I have to fill in, all of that changes. But the core of what I believe social work to be and why I wanted to be a social worker and why I do it now have remained the same. And so that can be really helpful. So when I was sitting planning, how am I going to work with these students? What on earth am I going to do with them? What can they do on a virtual placement, never leaving their bedroom effectively, which is how it was presented to me at the beginning. And I was sitting at my desk in my little office, which is it makes it sound posh. It's just a tiny room at the side of the kitchen that I turned into an office. This is the view taken from, I'm sitting in the chair, the computer's in front of me. I've got the PCF domain stuck on the wall. And then quite a long time ago, a friend bought me the poster that sits above. It's my favourite phrase. I use it a lot in my professional life. Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, but it's about learning how to dance in the rain. And I was just sitting, and I suppose they've been there for ages. So both those posters have been stuck in the same place for a long time. But this is the first time I probably just sat, and I sat back and I stopped typing and I stopped doing, and I just thought for a while. I just reflected, because I thought, how on earth am I going to do this with these students? And I took that stage of reflection for action. And for the first time, I noticed the similarity of colours between the poster and the professional capabilities framework. If you look, they are identical colours. It uses identical colours when you look at that and capture it. And what I began to realise was this also connects to the what, the why, and the how. The super domains, the 3 super domains that we've got. Practice is the what, purpose is the why, and impact is the how. And it gave me some security then, because I was thinking, whatever these students do, it will reflect what social workers are doing at the moment. And what social work is not going to change. How we do it might change, but what it is not going to change. And that will reflect the PCF domains. So I returned back to that word virtual. And this is the debate that Joe mentioned earlier. Because if you go for a dictionary definition of the word virtual, it is almost or nearly as described, or it's not physically existing as such, but being made by software to appear to do so, almost like it's not a real thing. You know, you've got a hologram of a practice educator or whatever. But I was thinking, well, what we're doing is real. We're still doing social work. It's still real. It's not virtual. It's not only, being made to look like it's happening. It's still happening. It's just happening in a different way. Maybe it's in a virtual space, but it's not a virtual placement. So even the final report that I had to write, it had on the title of it, virtual placement. All of the students that I worked with did leave their bedrooms on many occasions. They did go out, they did go on visits, they did go into offices. But at the start, it was a panic mode, I think, from universities to say, we've just got to keep these students going out on placement. And I do know that some programs did entirely replace their first placement with a virtual placement, just sitting at a computer and doing project work with one practice educator overseeing 30 students. And it was really just a research project. Now, to me, that's not a placement. So I think we need to be thinking about, we can still do placements in a remote world. So I would now talk about remote rather than virtual, but the virtual is very much what was being presented to me. We're still doing social work. And so I think Grace was going to say something around that slide, or possibly this slide, I'm not sure, but I would I've got Scrabble letters here. From the word virtual, I would just spell out, well, social work is still happening. The PCF is supposed to reflect what social work is about, and it's supposed to mirror the complexity and the interconnected nature of what we do. And the knowledge and skills statements reflect the knowledge and skills required for practice in particular areas. How we do what we do is changing, but it's still the same stuff. We're still doing social work. We're just doing it in a different way, in a different place. And so I came at it from that angle and really tried to look at the opportunities that are available are still there. So I don't know, Grace was going to say something, but as you're going to say it, Grace, I'm just going to stick this slide up to say they're all of the opportunities that are available, but I know you've got some things to share at this point. So
I was just going to say that you're absolutely correct, because I mean, we said virtual and it looked like it's something out of the blue. Virtual working for me is we're still carrying out the usual duties, intervention, supporting families, liaising with partner agencies, doing 47, everything, but just not having that physical contact, but doing it in a non-physical manner. For instance, home visits. We were very creative. We did some visits via WhatsApp videos. We did doorstep visit. We kind of some of these child in need cases. When we did the virtual, we tell the parents to like put the video on and go around the house, you know, and they did it. And where we kind of quote unquote catch them out is we're like, so can I see that room? Oh no, the key is not working, the doorknob is not working. We kind of knew there's something there you don't want us to see. And with the older children, we social workers do it, creativity, in the sense that with permission and with consent from their parents, we take them out for a walk, you know, the mask on, have a chat. So we still get their views, ascertain their wishes and feelings, you know, because sometimes, yes, we have the difficulties whereby you do your virtual WhatsApp video and the mom is there, although the child is speaking to you and the child is going, yes, no, no, yes. And then we create proxy visits. Teachers see the children, you know, we do proxy visits, we get all those help us with the assessment. So for me is, like you said, Siobhan, the social work is still there, virtual or no virtual, we're still doing it. Like when, for instance, when I wrote my student report, we have to account for the PCFs, but it's how did we do it? How was it achieved? What way, what creative way did we get to do it? I mean, I did one of the observation with my students in the park with a 14-year-old boy. He was in the park and he just sat there. And it was lovely to see how creative my student was. And the child was able to say things he wouldn't say in front of the dad. And for me, it can be virtual, but we're still doing it. In terms of learning opportunities for me, there were things like supervision was key for me, very, very key. You know, I made sure there were the check-ins was also, I do check-ins every day, every single day. Say, for instance, I was on leave for 4 days last week. And as soon as I came into on Monday, the first thing I did was to check in. How are you? How is everybody? And one thing I found out with those check-ins, it brought my team closer. Because in the conventional world, we come to the office, good morning, everybody go about the business, visit and everything. But with this one, I found I had more empathy. I don't know how, but I recognized that in myself. I had more empathy. I was like, oh, didn't I have that before? But I had more empathy. I want to know how people are. There were the boarding up with there, the reading, the training. So people had to get for in my local authority, we found out that people got better with technology. It was a smarter way of working. People type up their visits and their meetings quicker. And some people, in terms of the team meeting, I used my team meeting, I think my team meeting, they said it helped them with their morale, you know, their headspace, you know, they kind of take out a lot of things, what's been going on with them. So for my student, he said something that, Grace, wanting the virtual working, working this virtually has done for me is, in as much as I did the conventional one for 3 weeks, it helped me to see the difference. And when we eventually go back to normal, I can do both. And for me, it was very reassuring that he was able to identify that, knowing the difference, which, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of things in this virtual working that need to stay. It needs to remain.
I agree. I think there are some things that we're doing now that work better, that people prefer, you know, and I think, Grace, you're quite right. All the learning opportunities, they're still there. You know, this diagram that's on the screen now, this is taken from 2014. This isn't something that was produced for the pandemic. And yet, if you work around all of those are still available. All of those we can still do in new ways of working. So I would suggest that actually there are lots of opportunities, and there are, you know, it really worried me to start off with how it was going to work, but it went brilliantly. And I'm going to share with you now I start off, and we'll talk about this next time, because the next webinar we're going to do together is about supervision. So we'll talk about supervision and how supervision's going. But I open up supervision with student bringing a picture or a postcard to the beginning of supervision to say, here's how I'm feeling at the moment. And so and then we put them all together at the end, and it maps their journey. So I'll show you how I do that in the next webinar. But this one is a picture that one of the students brought to the beginning of supervision quite early. And I found it really interesting. And in a way, it kind of describes what it must feel like to be in a virtual placement. So I think it's a photograph taken from, you know, it's like a rehearsal, and it's like behind the scenes, if you like. And this student said, I felt like coming on a placement, I was going to get to the opportunity to rehearse how to be a social worker, you know, to practice being a social worker. But he said, actually, what I feel like is I'm kind of behind the scenes, because I'm not really getting, because he was at the beginning, he was asked to observe meetings, but he was asked to switch his camera off and his microphone off. And he said, I might as well not be there really, because I can't take part. He said, I'm learning loads just from listening. But actually, how am I going to use this to demonstrate my practice? And that was a real concern to him. And he said, I feel like I'm in the spotlight. Look, the spotlight's shining on me. I'm supposed to be showing what I can do, but I feel like I've not been able to get in yet. It looks like everyone that's there looks like they're enjoying themselves, they're getting ready, and I just feel a bit excluded. And it was really helpful for him to talk about that, for us to then look at how will we be able to stop you feeling excluded. So using this can be really helpful, and just thinking through all the stuff still going on. You just have to come out from behind the scenes. You just got to help that person to get through from behind the scenes. But for me, when he showed me that, it reminded me of situated learning theory as a theory. And that's just to kind of the final part, I suppose, of what I want us to talk about this afternoon, is the where of placements. So skilled practice educators are good at asking questions. And so far, we've looked at a number of questions about student learning in the pandemic, but we've not looked at the key aspect of where, the actual detail of where is this happening. And that relates into situated learning theory. Any of you who are doing your practice educator professional standards have probably read about situated learning theory. The whole concept of practice learning is based on situated learning theory, which says people learn from being in the situation that it takes place. And I got quite worried about this when I was working with students, knowing they're not going to be sitting in an office. They're not going to learn from incidentally just what's going on around them, just from listening in. They won't have that opportunity to do legitimate peripheral participation, which is basically what the guy was talking about when he said I'm behind the scenes. That is okay at the beginning of a placement, but it's then how do you move in to the centre? How do you move to centre stage as the placement progresses? So I kind of revisited situated learning theory when I was planning for working with these students. And actually what I found really made me feel much better. So I found this in a more recent writing about situated learning theory, and Bates refers to it as socially situated learning theory, and he says it suggests that learning takes place through the relationships between people and through connecting prior knowledge with authentic, informal, and often unintended contextual learning. The key word here for me was it's not necessarily about the place, it's about the relationships. And I think what Grace has just said is really key. The fact that connecting with your team and doing those regular check-ins, and actually it's brought the team closer together, I think is very true. Lots of people have said that because there's been more, I think, thought gone into how to keep people connected. We've almost connected on a clearer way, really. So whatever method you use, according to Bates, the situated learning experience should encourage students to tap their prior knowledge, to search out real world learning opportunities, and to not be afraid to challenge others in their community of practice. And I think that's really helpful, and it made me feel better about what I was about to do with these students on a virtual placement. What I realized was, this is old stuff about what creates a good adult learning environment, and just revisiting that, it's kind of made me recognize that actually a good adult learning environment isn't about the place. It's not about the space. It's about the environment of relationships. It's about the way in which the practice educator works with and supports the student, and how they maintain positivity within the placement. That's the stuff that really matters and that is really important. We know there's a real irony here that the image that's on this screen now is an adapted poster of this year's World Social Work Day. And it was on World Social Work Day that I went into lockdown, because all the training was cancelled from World Social Work Day onwards. And they changed it, didn't they? Because the original poster was shaking hands. So they made it a more physically distanced poster. But this year, World Social Work Day theme was all about promoting the importance of human relationships. And for me, actually, whether we're learning virtually or remotely or in place, in situ, the most important thing is relationships. And that's the thing that's going to impact on the learning environment. So I kind of let go of the worries about, will they have a desk? What about this? What about, I just let go of that stuff, because that didn't really matter. What really matters is the relationship. And Field, Jasper and Littler talk about the relationship between the practice educator and the student as a shared enterprise. And that reminded me of the share model that Joe and I worked on with Prosper Tedham. And so the next slide, this slide is something that I've been using for a long time. This is share in a placement. So share is a model which can be used to analyse situations. It's really good for analysis. And it's basically 5 separate but connected components of seeing, hearing, action, reading, and evaluation. The top row here is the student's share on a placement. So what does the student see on placement? What do they hear on placement? What do they do on placement? What do they read, and how do they evaluate the placement? The bottom row is the practice educator's share on placement. What does the practice educator see of the student? What do they hear about the student? What do they have to do to support the student? And so on. So what you've got really is the top row is learning, the bottom row is assessment, top row is student, bottom row is practice educator. You could equally apply this to being a newly qualified social worker and an assessor that works in lots of ways. And when I was needing to work virtually, I just looked at this and thought, the student can still see stuff. I've just got to think about safety in terms of traditional shadowing opportunities, but the student can easily observe practice via Teams. I thought about, how do I create a virtual community of practice for the student? How do I make sure, and I did what Grace referred to earlier, I checked in with the student every day on the first week of placement, and then I made sure that they had someone from their team checking in with them every day, so that they had regular conversations with buddies. You have to think through the fullest range of learning opportunities to think about what can the student do on placement, because there's loads of stuff they can do. Think about reading, but be clear with the student about what is essential reading, because I think one of the things that can happen is when they're working more from home, we can overload them with reading, and it's almost like, well, what's that mean? You know, we've got to make sure the reading is meaningful. And then we also just need to think about making sure that we ask the student regularly to evaluate how the placement is going. So that's the learning share. Today is about learning. When we do the assessment share, I'll show you how I adapted share for the new way of working across the bottom. But it works really well. And for me, the top tips are these, and I know Grace is going to share her top tips, but for working with students during the pandemic, with new ways of working, whether we call this remote or virtual or whatever we call it, for me, the most important things are that we plan the placement, because we need to recognise that that incidental learning is just less likely to happen. We need to be creative. I don't think we should get caught up around specific skills. If that work isn't being happening at the moment, then we don't get caught up around it. We need to adapt. We need to connect with other practice educators, which is where teaching partnerships are fabulous, because they can help you to connect with other practice educators. We need to remember the vital importance of relationships in practice learning. Use the what, why, how framework. Remember all the stuff that you ordinarily draw on. Don't throw things away just because we've got new ways of working. All that stuff still works. Don't undervalue the existing skills and knowledge that you've got. Use share, as the grid has just shown you. I think it can be very helpful. Make sure there's regular check-ins, as we've talked about. And I'd also say, just remember that you've got the opportunity to be very clear in final reports about the future learning needs of the students. So you don't have to panic. You don't have to think they've got to do everything, because if there's something they haven't done yet, that's okay. But the main thing, in my view, is to keep things positive. Don't say to students, oh, well, if we were in the real world, you'd have a much better deal, or, oh, it would be much better if, because actually this is their one and only go at doing practice learning. And they need to see that actually what you're doing is you're learning the skills we're going to need for social work in the future. So I think that's all great. So Grace, I think you wanted to add to the top tips, I think, did you?
Yeah. For me, I'm always about drawing out the positive in any situation, because that's what we do with working with client and service users. We go into their life to improve their situation. So if we're caught up in some situation, we don't moan about it. We adapt, we be creative and move on. And what better way for me to get prepared? I have an ASYE and a new qualified doing his ASYE. He's 3 weeks into his ASYE, and I was like more prepared having done a student, and he came with his anxieties, which quickly within 3 weeks now, he just like, oh, I'm into it. He just got into it. And it's about preparing for, what you are dealing with. I think one of my challenges in terms of my top tip was confidentiality was one of my challenges, confidentiality, because I thought of, okay, the student, ASYE, they're in their homes. How are we? How am I going to manage? Well, I had to ask the tough questions. I said, sorry, can I know who are in your household? I'm sorry, I asked the question. They had to tell me who in their household, where will they be working, where will they be assessing this? And I was satisfied, because these are clients' personal information. I need to be sure it's safe. I mean, I wouldn't do it with an experienced social worker, because I feel that they know. They're not new, but with a student or ASYE, I have to ask those, questions that people think that it's like being intrusive. But for me, and for my to be at peace and knowing that people's information are safe, I had to ask those questions. So all your top tips resonate with me, because as social workers, that is what we do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I agree. Thank you for that, Grace. And you bang on about that. Confidentiality is a big issue. We can talk about that one next time as well. So what I would say is, on the positive side, I think students and newly qualified workers are developing a whole range of new skills that they wouldn't have been able to demonstrate and develop if we were working in the old way. Like you said, Grace, people are using IT better. We're getting more creative in communication. I've definitely noticed an increased empathy, and you talked about that earlier. Improved critical thinking, I think improved self-awareness. So there's a lot of new skills that people have the opportunity. So I think we have to hold on to the positives of learning. Having said that, it's also important to think about feedback. And this is feedback from local students within the partnership about working with new ways of working. So one person talked about FOMO and a fear of missing out on learning opportunities that they might get in an open plan office, hearing conversations and observing colleagues interacting. And yeah, we are going to miss elements of that with home-based working. Another person has said, I felt uncomfortable calling colleagues when I was stuck because I worried about disturbing people because they might be busy. But they said I reverted to using the chat function and that was effective. So great, they found their way out of that dilemma and that difficulty. Another local student has talked about undertaking direct work assessments and making contact via video call. So not being able to see the environment and being a bit worried about not having the same level of experience to adapt as experienced practitioners. But still, I think they're adapting and doing really well. Outside of this local authority, these are some of the pieces of feedback that I've had, because we need to think about what are students thinking. So as Grace said there, one student has said to me they've not even been on placement yet, but he's saying, my main concern is, how am I going to ensure a confidential environment working at home? Because I live in a very busy house and I share my bedroom with siblings. How am I going to do this? And I do think that's a really important question for us to be able to think about. How do we do, as Grace has done, talked about who's in your household, where are you going to be working? This stuff matters, and we need to talk to students about it. Another student has said it's been an isolating experience and very difficult at times due to the added pressure of not being able to remove work from my home. And I have missed seeing people, and I feel it has impacted on my practice and on my learning. But another student said, but I was able to build up a good relationship with my practice educator. And a lot of students have said they feel they've got closer to their practice educators because of new ways of working. It was easier, this student said, having supervision over the telephone or video calling, and my practice educator was really supportive. She did prefer it via video. Being able to see someone was better. But remember, all of this feedback is the most important thing is relationship between student and educator. Really important. And today we've been looking predominantly at learning. We've got another session coming up looking at supervision, and then a final one with me looking at assessment. But the student and educator relationship is perhaps the most important thing, and working with connectivity is vital. In terms of learning and learning theory, I just want to finish off this input by just talking about surface approaches or deep approaches. And you'll get the slides, so I'm not going to read all this out to you, other than surface approach is generally not seen as good as a deeper approach. We want to encourage students to have a deeper approach to learning. And one of the things that's always struck me about this is I hear so many practice educators saying, but that student's taking a surface approach, almost as though it's down to the student. But I revisited this at the start of working differently. And Horton says we shouldn't identify the student with a fixed approach to learning. It's the design of the learning opportunity that encourages students to adopt a particular approach. Very crudely, deep is good and surface is bad. And we should teach in a way that encourages students to adopt a deeper approach. And I think very strongly we can still do that, even with new ways of working. And in fact, working with students, they can take a deeper approach if we show leadership. We show leadership as practice educators. We think about the impact of the environment. We take into account anti-oppressive practice and work in an anti-oppressive way with students. Think about the relationships that are involved in practice learning. Think about the students' learning needs and how we're going to meet those learning needs. Identify appropriate learning opportunities to meet those needs. Think about new ways of working and adapt to those. Be creative within those, and all of that will lead to growth. And what you have there is the word learning spelt out from what we've talked about in the session today, and what Grace has shared with us about her local experiences. And I've loved learning from Grace, so thank you for sharing things, Grace. We're coming almost to the end of the time that we have together. I've left some time for questions or thoughts from the chat, but then also during this, if people want to, I had a conversation with Chris and Mihaela earlier. If you would like to have the ability to show yourself on screen, we did test it out with a couple of people earlier, didn't we? If people want to be seen on screen, it would be lovely to take a screenshot of everybody who's here. So we would like to be able to switch your cameras off, switch your cameras on, sorry, at the end of the session. So if you want to, put your hand up. Or whatever you want to do, basically. Chris and Mihaela, while I'm just talking about final chat things here, you'll all be promoted to panelists. And then once you've been promoted to a panelist, you can then switch on your camera if you want to. And we might be able to just have a little chat if we have a few minutes at the end. But whilst that's happening, Jo, are there any comments in the chat that you would want to share, or is there anything that you would like me to think of as we're talking through now?
I mean, not especially. But I guess it's important to acknowledge that the virtual world, whilst it has many benefits, it can also have some downsides, and people are digitally excluded. And obviously and that, you know, some students are also digitally excluded by not having broadband at home, or they're in a situation where there's only one computer in the house that's been shared by kids, other adults, or, you know, not having spaces. So I do feel for not only students but anyone in that situation, that this, you know, that they can be excluded. And Chris was sharing an example of a student who wrote their dissertation in the car because that was the place to get away from the family. Now, you know, part of me thinks, oh, that's awful, but then I reflected that actually I've used the car to write usually when I'm dropping kids off and I don't want to watch them play football, but I wasn't driving at the time. So but for me it was very much choice that I was going to use this kind of space, you know, this to write. And, you know, my car was warm. So that's really all I wanted to comment. That, and then that we work with also, I'm not saying that are probably likely to be excluded as well. And I just kind of, my kind of minds in education where the promised laptops to children in need didn't happen, you know. So I'm thinking about digital exclusion for children as well.
I agree, absolutely. As you've been saying all of those things, though, we now have 44 panelists, because we have we've upgraded people. I promoted a load of people. I think obviously Chris and Mahela have also done that. So if people wish to now, I'm going to stop the screen share. I'll just show you, if we go back to the screen share, I'll just show you that when it's sent out to you, all of the references are at the end of the presentation. But I'm now going to stop the screen sharing. Well, thank you ever so much all for attending today. I really enjoyed joining the teaching partnership for the session today. We've got 2 more coming up. So there's the next session, we'll be looking at the practicalities of supervision in the in the new world, and then we'll be looking at assessment. So you've got 3 sessions all together. So, but that's the input finished from me, and you will have the slides. So it's over to you, Jo.
Okay, so it's 15:53, so you've still got 7 minutes left. So don't worry, we're not going to make you sit in silence. But just one person said, I know these aren't.
Oh, Jo, you've gone mute.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. So as I said, we've got now 6 minutes because I wasted a minute. But Christine Nax just said it wasn't a question, but just to say thank you very much. It was a fantastic session. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much. I mean, I've seen Siobhan many a times, but every time I see her, there's always something different and new. So thank you from me. Lots of people saying thank you. But is there anyone that would like to make a comment or question, or perhaps think about what might you now do differently as a result of this session? I know it's a question everyone asks, but really that's the point, that you think about your work differently or try and do something different. So if you're shy or don't want to put yourself forward, perhaps put it in the chat. But we like to know, what might you do differently now as a practice educator? Evaluation forms will be sent.
I've just seen a really interesting question, because now I'm not screen sharing, I'm able to see the chat, and I've just seen a really interesting question in the chat. I'm just going to try and move up a bit again now because I've lost it because it's moving. But I think it was Alfred who says, we usually arrange for students to do visits to agencies we work with as part of their induction, and what's the best way to do this now? And I agree with that question, Alfred, that I think it can be challenging, and I have thought about, should some students still go out and do visits? I think we need to do a risk assessment of that. What's the risk of them taking COVID to that agency? What's the risk of them if agencies are still doing things in person? But then I'd also say you can arrange for them to make connection with someone in that organisation via whatever system you're using. So whether you're using Teams or whether you're using Zoom, or and they can learn about that organisation, and how maybe ask them to gather some information from that organisation about how have you adapted to COVID and what are you doing in response to COVID, and so they can actually just go and, if you like, meet those agencies but in a different way. I think that would be my advice. I don't know if Grace has got any advice, but I think that would be my thoughts on that. So yeah. Okay.
So any other final thoughts or comments from anyone? So I would just like to thank Siobhan again. So Siobhan, from me.
Thank you. I just maybe should just say to people, if you haven't done your Social Work England CPD yet, get it done, and maybe use attending today and reflecting on today as one of your CPD pieces, because you could do, couldn't you, and get that up there and get your Social Work England thing done. Yeah.
And just thank the panelists, because not only panelists but organisers. So we've got Chris Lane from London Met, Mamta from Newham, London Borough of Newham, Mahala from London Met, Binda. You're now at Havering working for the Teaching Partnership, and I haven't missed anyone else out, have I?
Well, there was another great Grace as
yeah,
the guest speaker today.
And I'd really like to thank Grace for coming along and sharing, your really useful experience. So thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Grace. I think it's always nice to be joined by someone in the Teaching Partnership. So in each session, we're going to be joined by someone from within the Teaching Partnership, and I think that brings something different as well, doesn't it? So
yeah. So I'm now going to bring this event to a close. What marvellous timing. Look, we're 2 minutes early. So thank you all for attending. I know that you're all really, really busy and juggling, loads of things. And I want to thank you on behalf of Uriel, and Chris won't mind me saying London Met, because we can't run our programmes without you. And I think it's important to remember that we all want the same thing. So universities, placement, students, we all want the same things, which is to give the best challenging, robust, but supportive learning experience for students, because mostly our students go on to work in your local authority. But I know I often feel practice educators don't get the thanks that they really are due, and it's seen as due from your organisation. It's seen as a bit of a hobby. But I know all the really hard work that goes into students, especially, having to adapt so quickly. So thank you from Chris and I, the university perspective. Thank you, practice educators. Okay, so goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at our other events. And we've got an exciting programme planned.